Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fourth webinar being hosted by Oppras during 2017. The focus on this webinar is how do you take into account trade-offs between ecosystem services in land management decision making. To talk us through these issues, we have three speakers. Dr. Astrid van Teffelen at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, Free University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. We also have Dr. Sandra Laborel at the Laboratoire d'Écologie Alpine at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Grenoble in France, and Professor Sven Lautenbach from the IGG, that's the Institute of Geodesy and Geoinformation at the Universität von Bonn in Germany. We have three speakers, and they each have three topics to get through, but in the hour that we have ahead of us, we would also very much encourage you to ask questions. The way we would suggest you ask a question is if you look at the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a drop-down menu box, and you will see there a title called Questions. And if you click on Questions, a little box appears, and you can write your questions directly into that box. They'll then get sent through to us, and my colleague Kathleen will organize them and send them through to me so that we can pick those up. It could be that we do not have time for all the questions, in which case, if your question can't be fitted in, please don't worry. Our presenters will answer your question. Please have a look at the Oppla website, and they will provide a written answer to your question. So just once again, as you're listening to the speakers, if you have a question or a comment, or if you disagree with something they've said or would like to endorse it, just go to the questions box. It's on the right-hand side of your screen. You type your question in there, press send, it comes through to us, and then we pick it up and you get a chance to have your question answered. Without further ado then, it's my great pleasure to invite our first speaker to address us, Sven Lautenbach, and he's going to be talking about how to take trade-offs into account between ecosystem services in land management decision making. Sven, are you with us? Can I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you, Martin. Also, a warm welcome from my side. The talk I'm going to give you now has the idea of introducing you into the topic, providing an overview about different approaches how to deal with trade-offs in land use decision making, as well as highlighting a few aspects on how to deal or how to use optimization approaches in that aspects. Other aspects will be dealt by the other speakers, Sandra Lavorel and Astrid van Teffelen. So the reason why we have trade-offs is basically that land is a scarce resource. We have to make a decision where to place which land use. The amount of goods and services we derive from different land uses are affected directly and indirectly by the type of land use we put somewhere. The system, or the complexity of the system, is increased since we have to assume that the trade-offs differ in space. So the same land use might not lead to say, a different set of services, but to a different amount of services produced in different part of a region. To provide you with a short example from a German case study of the Mulde Basin, where we looked at the effects of afforestation measures by scenarios on carbon sequestration as well as on plant species richness. The map here shows you both synergies as well as trade-offs between carbon storage as well as increases or decreases in plant species richness. here exemplified by red list plant species. So what you see here is in the greenish colors are synergy relationships. So we have more forest that leads to more carbon sequestration and leads to an increase in the number of red listed plant species. However, we also have this brownish colors where the cells where these regions indicate that there is a trade-off. That means more forest in this situation leads also to an increase in carbon storage. That's kind of relatively obvious. But there's a negative side effect on species richness in which areas. This is, of course, interesting if you look at the problem from a spatial planning perspective, because these would be regions where you would avoid to put too much forest in there and just go for the other regions where you have synergies. It's even more complex if you think not just about land use composition, so how much amount of a different land use classes we put somewhere, but also if you think about land use intensity or land use configuration, like fragmentation, connectivity, or the distance between different land use classes. Why is it important to know about these trade-offs? If you think from a perspective of landscape planning or environmental management, the way we manage the land has effects on who benefits, what benefits are maintained, enhanced, or reduced, where these gains and losses are located in space as well as in time, and again, the question of who wins and who loses could be addressed by that. So we have to deal with that trade-offs. The question is, how can science help with that? What is the existing knowledge about that? I'm first presenting you a short overview about a current review study we did. This is a matrix having at both the X and the Y axis different services classified according to the sizes classification, and the different symbols indicate the direction of the effect. If you have a triangle in red looking downwards, this is indicating a trade-off between these two services. And if you have a greenish upward-facing triangle, this is indicating a synergy. We also have no effect relationship between services and situations where we had kind of mixed results from different studies on that. Without going into too much details here, just a few things I would like to highlight. Cultural services get along quite well typically, as well as regulating services. There are two trade-off situations, but most regulating services get along quite well, so we can have more of one and more of the other. Cultural and regulating services are friendly to neutral, but we have a conflict-prone relationship if you look at provisioning and regulating services. So those tend to trade off. So this is kind of the current state of the art if you look at what's in the literature, but whereas you want to know more about this. So it's not just the direction of the effect, but also like about the strength of the effect, or which services kind of co-occur together. There are different motivations behind different trade-off studies. So the term trade-off in ecosystem services is used in a diverse way. Therefore, I'm going to talk you through the main, say, strains of research here. The first strain of research looks at co-occurrences of services, typically in space, but sometimes also in time. So the question is, which services do co-occur in space? Are there bundles of services that occur together? Underlying questions are those such as, does the presence of one ecosystem service exclude the presence of another? Or are we able to identify locations that exhibit similar ecosystem service combinations? If we go one step further, then there's the question, what drivers affect ecosystem services, both in a direct or an indirect way? So if you think for a land use decision like cutting down the forest and replacing it with cropland, where there's obvious effects on food provisioning as well as in timber provisioning, but also has effects on, say, erosion and water quality. With erosion, we also do have a feedback, say, if we intensify our cropland land use. This leads to more food provisioning, but also to an increase of erosion that might feed back on the amount of food provisioning. So this is when we are looking at drivers, trying to identify with relationships. And there's a big group of studies looking at the trade-off of specific management options, just like if you want to have more bioenergy in a specific part, if you want to have a nature conservation approach somewhere, if you want to have zoning in different aspects. Well, this is very specific land use decisions, and then the question is, well, what goods and services do we get in option A or option B, and can we compare those? This is kind of similar to cost-benefit analysis, but without necessarily putting dollar tax or euro tax to the different services. You can compare them also just based on their biophysical provisioning of the services. And last but not least, there's a strain of studies that looks at the potential of a system to deliver different services. So the question, what is the capacity of a system to provide different ecosystem services at the same time? This is going beyond testing just a few alternatives, but testing many different alternatives. Say, if you think of different land use allocation, this is trying to test them all, or a large number of them, and trying to identify the so-called production possibility frontier, or the Pareto frontier, it's been called as well. This is the land use configurations or land use allocations where we cannot increase in one direction, in one objective, without losing something in other objectives. So this describes the trade-offs from the perspective of potential of a system to deliver those services. This goes beyond a scenario analysis. In a scenario analysis, typically, we test a few well-thought alternatives with respect to the goods and services produced. But there might be suboptimal scenarios, which means we could do better in one or in several objectives without losing something the other. So if we're interested in something like a marginal benefit, we are really interested in estimating that Pareto frontier, so the set of best solutions. The problem is that in most situations we cannot really test all different combinations because there are so many different combinations. We think of it in a spatial way. So the question is where to put which land use. Therefore, we typically rely on optimization techniques. Just showing you an example here from a current study where we use a model, a watershed model, to estimate the effects of different crop rotations, these are the control parameters, on a number of objectives. In this case, it's a four-dimensional objective function. Low flow at the outlet of a catchment, the nitrate concentration at the outlet of a catchment, as well as food yield and bioenergy yield. And when there's an optimization approach that tries to optimize the control parameters, that the objective function is optimized with respect to that criterion of non-dominance, trying to estimate that Pareto frontier. And in addition, there could be scenarios as well. The result look like that. We have at the x-axis the yield of biogas crops, and the y-axis the yield of food and fodder crops. Since the area is limited, so we do not consider land use change, but only land use modification, so just changing crop rotations on cropland, we have an obvious trade-off. More bioenergy crops means less food and fodder production. However, there's a big scatter, because this is a four-dimensional plot actually, or a two-dimensional slice of a four-dimensional hyperspace, because we also have two environmental objectives here, the nitrate concentration as well as the low flow, indicated by the size of the different points as well as by the color of it. That means the answer, is bioenergy a good or a bad thing, is not that easy because it depends where you look at. Which crop rotations are replaced by which crop rotation in which part of a catchment. There are two figures here. To the left, it's a purely corn-based bioenergy system, while on the right, we have a two-culture system. Without going into details, you will be able to see that there are differences in the shape of that frontier. So the trade-offs are different if you look at different options. Another example is the trade-off between food provisioning, water provisioning, as well as carbon sequestration at the global scale. We looked at land use at the global scale at a 1 degree Celsius resolution, comparing the effect of 5 different crop functional types, as well as potential natural vegetation. And the question now is, where do we put which crop? If we want to get more food with the lowest cost possible with respect to carbon as well as to water. Each of that points in that three-dimensional space here represents a complete land use map of the global land use map. They are colored as well because we have some things in common, so this is a result of a cluster analysis that might be used to derive more knowledge from that. So to conclude, the starting point is that land is a scarce resource, so we have to face trade-offs of our land use decisions. There's a variety of tools better applicable for trade-off analysis. Depending on what you're interested in, you might choose a different set of tools. I hope I provided you an overview here. In the perspective of, at least of a trade optimization approach, it's not always necessarily possible to express a trade-off in a single number. But it might be interesting to look at that shape. You might recall the shape from the slide just before. That hyperplan was not having always the same deviation. There was no clear gradient. It was changing depending on the level of the different services. So therefore, it might be interesting. Of course, it comes at the cost that it's potentially high dimensional. And least but not last, I should mention that, of course, the reliability of a trade-off analysis depends on the reliability of the underlying models and data. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm closing and happy to take your questions.
Sven, thank you very much. Well, we have two questions from Dara Carroll and from Michael Peter. Dara will be coming to you in a minute, so you can ask your question directly. But before that, Sven, we have a written question from Michael Peter. And he says, how do you deal with trade-offs between ecosystem services decided by individuals and groups?
So this, I guess this comes down to the question who loses and who profits from a decision. That's a very good question. One way of dealing with that is the concept of service sheds. So you could identify, if you think of it in a spatial way, you could identify areas where people benefit from the services. So kind of defining the area of, say, where a decision about water quality or water provisioning affects people, the water availability being something that is spatially explicit. I mean, you could think of who profits actually from that benefit in a specific part of it. That might be a way to incorporate that. Otherwise, you would have to identify the different demands of the different groups and take that into account. So if you think of it with multi-objective optimization, then the ideas that I as a scientist, I'm not providing or aiming at identifying a single solution, but presenting the whole possibility space. So the best we can do, and then it would be up to, in a democratic process to make a decision about to specify preference of different stakeholders and then come to a compromise solution which might be best. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, no, thank you, Sven. We're going to go over to Dara Carroll, who has a question about built up and urban areas. Dara, the microphone should now be with you. Please feel free to ask your question.
My question was the ability of urban planners to, I suppose, to try and calculate, make decisions based on the ecosystem services that come from green infrastructure solutions as opposed to grey infrastructure solutions in the built-up urban environment. So that was my query.
Okay, thank you for that question. So with about to green urban infrastructure, there are a number of studies who address effects of different management options in the urban environment. There also has been recently one or two papers published by a PhD student of mine focusing on trade-offs of land use decisions using that optimization approach in Switzerland. He has been focusing more on the effect of soil sealing as well as the compactness of a city, so there might be some interesting results on that. In principle, it's of course possible to apply all that tools also to the urban domain. It's a question of which models and data are in place to estimate that effects.
Great, Sven, thank you very much, and Dara, thank you also for your question. We have one final question for this round from Ingo Schuder. Ingo, I think you're online in the webinar. We're going to try and find you now and hand the microphone over to you. Ingo, are you there?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please, ask your question.
Okay, great. Sven, thank you very much for your really interesting presentation, and there's some new thoughts and models and techniques in there, which is really impressive and great science. I wondered about communicating this to policy and decision makers. I think they may struggle with multidimensional hyperspaces. So, have you got an example where you've used this approach already in a real policy decision-making example, and how did you go about it?
So that's a very good question. So I do have an example, but I don't have a slide here, unfortunately. But this example that I showed you about the bioenergy versus food versus water quality and water quantity trade-off, something that we discussed with the regional agencies. You're absolutely right that it's very hard to show something, a four-dimensional or even higher dimensional solution. So what we aimed for, what we used, is a kind of hierarchical approach, basically zooming in into specific parts, having kind of a cluster analysis ahead of time, and then saying, well, these are regions where we have relatively high food provisioning or relatively high bioenergy provisioning, or with respect to environmental conditions, specific kind of sets of values. And then stakeholders would then pick a specific part of that and say, well, we are not interested in that anything anymore, but we just want to like to focus on that. Another approach that I haven't used personally, but colleagues of mine have used, is to come up with, say, preferential objectives. So in many situations, people might be able to say, well, it's all important, but there are 2 or 3 objectives that are of most concern, say. And then we might just display it with respect to that, and then have the other objectives kind of coming in later. So that are possible approaches to deal with that. You're absolutely right that this multidimensionality is really an issue if you want to communicate that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. That brings us to our second presentation. But ladies and gentlemen, please remember, if you would like to ask a question, then as our other participants so far, please just type your question into the questions box. It then gets sent to me, and I can then direct the question to you. So if you have any comments, things that you agree or disagree with, please just put your question in the question box, and we can then pick it up and get the microphone to you. So I'd now like to hand over to Sandra Lavorel. Sandra, I think the microphone is with you.
Yes, thank you, Martin.
Great.
Hello, everybody. So I'm pleased to continue on Sven's introductory presentation by providing some concrete examples for how we operationalize this trade-off analysis for a targeted study in the urban region of Grenoble. So that's a city, that's a large city in the French Alps. So just to give you a bit of an idea of a location, if you haven't been skiing in that region before, this is a city that is built in the Alps and is very typical of situations of mountain-urban interface, and is essentially inhabited by people who think that this is a highly attractive location, especially in terms of natural resources and environmental amenities. Being very attractive, this area faces issues of urbanization most of the time at the expense of agricultural land, and therefore has been the place where there has been for the last 10 or so years a very proactive planning process in order to control that urban growth and favor a balanced development across the region. So in this analysis, we aim to look into the future of the area from the perspective of ecosystem services, and to demonstrate how we can use an ecosystem service-based approach, especially focusing on synergies and trade-offs of ecosystem services, our topic today. So just to give you an idea, if you haven't visited this area before, it's very typically made of very diverse landscapes, going all the way from flat areas with crops to a fairly dense urban area, and all the way to the tops of mountains. In this study, we identified with a panel of stakeholders from different economic sectors of the region a whole panel of ecosystem services that they think are important to focus on when trying to think about planning and planning for this area and managing in the future. So without going into details here, you can see that people are interested in finding out about trade-offs between provisioning services, mainly agriculture and also forestry, some cultural services, since, as I mentioned, many people who live in this area enjoy it from a cultural point of view, and also 7 regulating services. So we took a spatially explicit approach to our analysis of trade-offs among ecosystem services, and our starting point was a series of maps where we modeled each of the ecosystem services that from the list that you just saw before, and this modeling took place for the current being 2009, the start of our study maps, and for the future under 4 scenarios for 2040. So something important that came out of our first discussion with the stakeholders is that to understand trade-offs in this ecosystem service trade-offs in this area, and to be able to use them for planning and management, we really had better consider the region in terms of 3 broad ensembles. The first one is the peri-urban environment, so that essentially the bottom of the valleys where there is the city and urban sprawls, as well as fairly intensive production agriculture. Forested areas, which tend to be in the mountains, and also rural areas, so in yellow on this map, which are the areas which are often characterized by mosaics of agriculture, settlements, and bits of forest. So the first thing we did was to address the question that Sven presented just before: where are the trade-offs in ecosystem services? And here we just took our ecosystem service maps and looked at the co-occurrence between different types of ecosystem services. So on this slide, you can see on the top the sets of the bundles of ecosystem services that we identified. That's the sets of ecosystem services that co-occur together. So each color on this map corresponds to one type of bundle of ecosystem services, which is also illustrated on the right-hand side radar diagram. So here for these 4 types of ecosystem service bundles for forests, we found that they were essentially located according to topography, and we're differentiating between essentially the different places along the hills. The differences between these ecosystem service bundles, as you can see on the right-hand side radar, are to do largely with their regulating ecosystem services, as well as their assets in terms of biodiversity. The same is illustrated in the the bottom part of the figure for the rural environments, where likewise we found 4 bundles of ecosystem services, but this time instead of being associated with topography, they were associated with main land use types. And again, on the radar, on the right-hand side, you can see that they're fairly different in terms of the ecosystem services that they provide. In particular, obviously, crop provision is only in areas that have cropland cover, but slightly more interestingly, water quality regulation in these landscapes are mainly provided by permanent grasslands. So these 2 maps illustrate how we can display in space for managers to use where the main sets of ecosystem services occur in this landscape. For the purposes of planning, we can zoom into these maps, and this is a zoom in on the map of ecosystem service bundles for the peri-urban landscapes, and we can analyze and co-interpret with the planners and managers how, at a very fine resolution here, these are maps at a 15-meter resolution, these different bundles of the ecosystem service occur. For instance, you can see that the gray areas here, which are urban, when I say in relation to the previous questions, urban is actually periurban, it's not the center of the cities, have habitats that are against what might perhaps be your expectations, are favorable for animal and plant diversity, and also have pretty important issues to do with water infiltration. However, when managers and planners think about a landscape, they often don't only think in terms of this biophysical support for ecosystem services, they think about managing the relationships between ecosystem services. So on this slightly complex set of diagrams here, you can see for each of our spaces, forest, periurban, and rural, how the stakeholders that we were working in this project, so again from multiple sectors of the economy, so agriculture, forestry, etc., urban development, how they were already able to think in terms of relationships between ecosystem services. I won't go into the details of these graphs here. This is just to tell you that this was the starting point for us to work with these stakeholders on how they perceive the hierarchy of importance and the relationships between ecosystem services. So this goes to the next question, is who benefits? And in other words, what are the social value trade-offs for this area? For this, we use an approach that is called Participatory Multi-Criteria Analysis, where we worked with the stakeholders to identify what were their priorities in terms of saying whether an area would score from their perspective as provisioning a good set of ecosystem services or a bad set of ecosystem services. So I'll give you an example of how we did this. In fact, we don't use numbers. We don't we don't use complex values. We don't use models at this stage to do this. We just talk with the stakeholders to find out how they judge, for example, a forest to provide an excellent level of ecosystem services. And so in this example, you see that rockfall protection had to be satisfied, so it was a 0-1 variable, and this was a precondition, or otherwise it would be an area that would be satisfactory for wood production and regulation services, or recreation services, or biodiversity. In the same way, our stakeholders qualified what they considered to be an excellent state for ecosystem services in rural areas, and likewise for peri-urban. So what you see on this slide is that these rules can become quite complex, and they actually illustrate the fact that the land managers and the planners have to deal with in their everyday business with fairly complex things. They can't just say, I'll optimize one service and see what happens to the others. On this, we might have some discussion, perhaps relating to what's been proposed before. So what did we find with these analyses? First, when we applied the rules that I just showed you, which were formulated by stakeholders, they were essentially proposing that good landscapes for our region are landscapes that are multifunctional. And so when we apply this rule, we obtain a map like this, where if you look at different colors, the shades of blue show that overall the multifunctionality of here a municipality, the scale where we aggregate is the municipality. They are, so the bluish colors, they are not at a very satisfactory level according to the multifunctionality rule that was built with our stakeholders. On the other hand, if it's orange or red, it's either quite satisfactory or even highly satisfactory. So if you eyeball this map, you will immediately recognize that it's dominated by blue shades. This was a large surprise to the stakeholders we were working with, because they had formulated these rules thinking that in the region we have good environmental quality, and there would be quite a few areas that would show up as providing a good or very good level of ecosystem services. So this led us to all sorts of very interesting discussions where stakeholders were able to debate the weight that they had given to different ecosystem services, and also the understanding of ecosystem service trade-offs that they had underpinning this evaluation. But most of all, this made them realize that their multifunctionality rule was in fact idealized, because there are things that you cannot have together. So typically in this region, the highly productive forests have very good environmental quality, but just because of the species that are there, they're never going to be the areas where you find the largest number of species. So you can't have these two criteria together in a rule. So as a result of this, we produced together some alternative definitions of multifunctionality and what became called sustainability. So if we take sustainability to be the preservation or regulating ecosystem services and biodiversity, this can be applied to the same type of analysis. And we explored with the stakeholders two variants. On the left-hand side, a sustainability rule combining criteria on ecosystem services and on regulating ecosystem services and biodiversity, but not incorporating any rules about provisioning ecosystem services. So if you think about sustainability, this would be the so-called economic part of sustainability. We compared this with the rules that incorporated provisioning ecosystem services as well, which is the right-hand side map. And so by looking at this map, you can see that these two maps, of course, the two maps are quite different. The left-hand side map, where we remove provisioning services from our assessment of multifunctionality, tends to be more orange and red than the right-hand side map, where provisioning services are incorporated. And the two areas that are circled in these two maps also show you that although the overall color of the map, if you will, has changed, it depends on the areas. So the first area, the first ellipse on the bottom left corner of the map shows you an area where, when we incorporate provisioning services, we lose in the overall assessed value of this area. So there is clearly a trade-off by incorporating provisioning services into our assessment. On the contrary, the area on the right-hand side of the map, the second ellipse, ends up with a better assessed value in ecosystem services. So again, an illustration of this trade-off between regulating services, biodiversity, and provisioning ecosystem services. Then we were very ambitious, and our stakeholders wanted to explore more options about how we value this landscape. And so we compared our original ideal multifunctionality, these two maps of sustainability options with and without provisioning services, with one fourth perspective, which we call the biodiversity focus. Here we considered only biodiversity indicators plus indicators of habitat quality, and especially because we were interested in aquatic biodiversity as well, ability to regulate water quality. And just without going into details here, you will very easily see that our four maps are very different again. So this, therefore, a very important conclusion for those aiming to manage trade-offs. It's not going to be easy business, because trade-offs in ecosystem services are very different depending on stakeholder values. Also, as I introduced, we were part of an ambition to assess a planning exercise where we compared, where we assessed not only the current situation, but also future scenarios for the area. And so here, comparing on the top row the same four maps for four different rules, or four different sets of social values for 2009, and what these maps become when we apply a scenario that was called rewilding. In other words, we tend to abandon agriculture in mountains, as well as in many areas that have high biodiversity values. And here what you can see by comparing the two sets of maps is that in the future we will have a different set of ecosystem service values across the area, but that this change, it depends very much on the rule that you are applying, on the values that you are applying. Going more specifically into this, comparing again our two sustainability rules, on top the rules without provisioning, the incorporation of provisioning services, and at the bottom those that incorporate provisioning ecosystem services for 3 scenarios this time. Again, you can see that we have very different assessments depending on the rules that we use, of which scenarios appear more favorable. We saw in the previous slide that, for example, the rewarding scenario in the middle, you will have very different outcomes of your assessment, mostly red and orange on top, so without the provisioning services, but mostly blue at the bottom when incorporating ecosystem services, so there's a provisioning ecosystem services, and that for the other scenarios, it's a more mixed assessment. So from this type of approach, we can conclude that the contrast across our scenarios change depending on the management objectives, and also that there are special trade-offs in outcomes, since any area of the map will have a different value according to both the scenario and the assessment rules that we apply. So to conclude, the evaluation of the trade-offs in the biophysical capacities for ecosystem services already give a good idea of where the main trade-offs and synergies are, and they tend to be strongly linked to land use and land cover. This is something that was already of strong interest to our stakeholders. However, they benefited mostly from a more complex approach that took into account social valuation by building complex rules that can capture the planners and managers' ecological and institutional knowledge. This process appeared particularly interesting because it really revealed some of the inconsistencies and the ideal vision, that idealized nature of the vision of multifunctionality that people thinking about the future of this region have. It led to an iterative research process where alternative rules were reformulated, and most importantly, of course, the maps that we produce here are of use to people that we work with, and of course are of use to us as scientists, but mostly their value was in fostering debate and learning around this understanding of ecosystem service trade-offs and how they change according to scenarios. And this is possibly one of the most important contributions to decision here. The scenarios shows that there are not only spatial trade-offs, but also temporal trade-offs in scenarios. And this is a useful basis to assess current planning and policy. We also showed, and this was part of the learning, that there is no ideal scenario for our area, and there will always be high spatial trade-offs in outcomes. With this, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Sandra, thank you very much. We actually have a question for clarification from Ingo Schuder around the word syndrome. Ingo, if you're still there, we're going to try and move the microphone to you. Could you just outline very briefly what clarification you're looking for?
Oh, hello, Sandra. Thank you very much for your presentation. So I think we would need to go back to that slide. I just you used the word syndrome in one slide, and I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that, or if, yeah, the context of that presentation. So I don't know if we have time for you to explain that, or if you could use a different word to explain it.
Well, syndrome is here understood as, it's like in medicine, it's a bunch of things that happen together, and it's diagnostic of an area. So in the case of urban, peri-urban areas that I was showing, This is a list of ecosystem services that managers can understand as a diagnosis of different types of land cover. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful.
Great. Thank you very much. We unfortunately, there are a couple more questions, but we need to move forward because of time. And please rest assured that your questions will be answered on the Oppla website in writing. But with the time that we have left, I'd like to very swiftly go over to Astrid, who will be introducing us to a topic of identifying priority areas for ecosystem services. And if you do have any questions, ladies and gentlemen, please just write it into the question box and then we'll try and pick it up as quickly as we can. Thank you very much.
Yes, hello everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Thanks for staying on. Let's see. Here we go. Good. I hope you can see my screen now. Indeed, so my presentation is hopefully complementary to the two presentations that we've had, and it's focusing on identifying priority areas for ecosystem services. So there's many studies who've been mapping ecosystem services. This is really just an example from South Africa. Just lots of maps created. This is also shown in the presentation of Sandra, for example. Maps of food production, wild foods, soil carbon storage, etc. But then when we are mapping these services, how can we then move on using them into spatial planning, for example? Well, we saw an example from Grenoble, from Sandra. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit more large scale, but also here in this example from Denmark, sorry, there's a reference missing, but it's not my own example. Many kind of metadata is created out of these individual maps of ecosystem services, looking at where are the bundles of ecosystem services, which areas provide similar services. And this is just an example of that from Denmark. And this is another example. We see this type of spider diagrams looking into which areas provide similar services and which areas provide different bundles of services. But what if questions are different in land use planning? For example, if there can be questions of which sites are suitable to expand urban areas or expand infrastructure or industry or agriculture. Preferably, that is to be done at sites with low biodiversity value or low ecosystem service value, in this particular example on ecosystem services. Or vice versa, which sites are of high biodiversity or ecosystem services relevance. Because there, in those areas of high importance, you would like to avoid negative impacts of land use change, or for example, take conservation measures. Answering such questions requires insight into relative value that sites in a region have for biodiversity and or ecosystem services. So rather than not only just the amount of services or amount of biodiversity that an area has, but its relative value compared to other sites, because in land use planning, you would have to decide what to do where. Okay, so taking it more, so if you'd be able to rank all the sites in your landscape from, so if you have, can I use my mouse? I think you can see my mouse. Okay, so if we put on a graph our landscape, putting on the left those areas in the landscape that contribute a lot to what I put here, conservation features, just replace that by ecosystem services. So the amount of ecosystem services that our study area contains, a lot of that is captured in the first part of the landscape, and the majority of the landscape typically provides a relatively lower amount of services. So if you could identify which areas are here on the left side of the curve, those have high conservation value, and areas that will be further down to the curve contribute relatively less to our ecosystem services amount. So if we could do that, that might be helpful to planners. So how do we do that? So to determine the relative value of sites, we have to look at the principle of complementarity. And the field of systematic conservation planning, so conservation for biodiversity, has shown that identifying hotspots based on the richness of features, so that's the number of species or the number of ecosystem services, is often not efficient in guiding land use planning. And that is because areas that are not very rich in features, but do have unique properties, they risk being ranked lower than sites that are actually very rich in features. But even though they are rich in features, they may also be represented by other sites, so they have a certain redundancy in these. And taking this concept of complementarity and redundancy into account is a strength of systematic conservation planning approaches. And two software packages that have been developed are Zonation, developed by the University of Helsinki, and the Marxan group of tools, which has been developed by the University of Queensland. These are typical software packages that can be used to answer these kind of questions. And what we did is we used the Zonation software package to test this type of approaches to ecosystem services. So initially, they were developed to design protected area networks, and this is just an example from a global study looking at species conservation. Well, what if we apply it to ecosystem services? Well, we didn't take a global approach. We took you can see that since about 10 years, this application of such tools has been applied to ecosystem services as well. But there are some important differences in whether you apply these to biodiversity or to ecosystem services. And the important differences are these. If you want to identify the main priority areas for species, it's important to look at how strong is the land or the water, but I typically have a terrestrial approach, how strong is the land to support populations of species, its capacity. But for ecosystem services, you do not just look at what is the capacity of land to provide services. You must also take into account, because we're talking about services to people, that their demand for a service, and whether the services can actually flow to people. So are those services provided at localities where they can actually meet demand? So we looked at the role of these factors in prioritizing areas for ecosystem services. So we applied it to Europe, and we looked at 5 ecosystem services. One was carbon sequestration, another one was flood regulation, and pollination, air quality regulation, and urban leisure. And as you can see on the right side, there is the carbon sequestration is a service that can be provided anywhere and has global benefits, whereas for flood regulation, you need to provide that service at a regional scale, at the scale of a watershed. And for pollination, air quality regulation, and urban leisure, you need to provide those services at more local scales. So if you just do a prioritization analysis using Zonation, looking at ecosystem services capacity, so you basically take maps of these 5 services and identify where the priority areas are in Europe. We made a binary map where we just highlight in blue the areas that belong to the top priority areas. If you take the first 17% of the landscape, which aligns with a target for protecting 17% of the land, but this is just an arbitrary threshold here. It's just for visualization. So the blue areas would be the priority areas across Europe. If we just focus on ecosystem services demand, not taking care of the effect of that we actually have to meet demand at a lower spatial scale. If we do incorporate that demand, the map looks very different. Then the top 17% of priority areas shifts from the more mountainous and more remote areas in Europe towards areas where actually the people live. And you see that actually the land use near where people live becomes of much more importance. And this is, this is not new for people working with ecosystem services, but it is just to show that applying these tools can be relevant for ecosystem services, but they must be applied with care, and one must take into account what is it that we're trying to prioritize here. The strength of the trade-offs differ for different services. This is just for pollination. So I showed you just EUC, which was the prioritization for capacity, and the EUD was the EU prioritization incorporating demand as well. And if you just, the line represents the first 17% of the landscape, so to say, the top priority areas. Then the red line, so with 17% of the landscape, you get only about 25% of the total amount of pollination services if you only focus on capacity. But if you had incorporated demand, so that, and then with the same amount of area, you could actually meet almost 80% of the capacity of pollination. And so you see the strength of the trade-off of pollination. If I move that there into the corner, I could show the other 4 services. Air quality regulation and urban leisure show an even stronger trade-off. The difference between the red line here and the purple line there is relatively strong, especially for urban leisure. And the trade-offs for carbon sequestration and flood regulation are reduced. Okay, I have to finish off, I see. Well, we also looked at the effects of land use change. I will not go into detail there, but what happens to our priority areas if land use changes over 20 years and we haven't taken measures, land management measures. Well, some areas are stable, priority areas, those are the areas in green. Some areas are important now, but not in the future. And some areas are important in the future, the purple ones and pink ones, but not currently. And why is that? Well, that's because, well, it could be that areas become better, but other areas are becoming worse. And by knowing that, we can already take action now. We can guide land use planning. So to conclude, identifying priority areas provides complementary information to the bundles or hotspot maps of ecosystem services. And what information is relevant for the decision-making process? Well, it depends on the type of question people have and what their objective is. But be careful in defining what information is needed. Ignoring the ecosystem services demand leads to the identification of priority areas in relatively remote regions where some benefits from the ecosystem services capacity to society are relatively small. And the effects of land use change can affect priority areas and give directions as to where protective measures may be most relevant or where restoration measures may be most effective. And the complementarity with the, for example, fine-scale optimization technique that Sven talked about and the detailed work with stakeholders that Sandra talked about could be a value of this type of analysis. Thank you very much.
Astrid, thank you very much. We have to end it there, ladies and gentlemen, but Astrid, just very quickly, you've set out the need for this, but why or what experience, if any, have you of policy or decision makers actually being able to use these methodologies and these analyses? How easy is it for policy makers to access this and be receptive to it?
Well, and one example I could give is not one of my own examples, but in New Zealand, fishermen and conservation managers have been sitting together around a table using a tool like this, like zonation, because they wanted to identify conservation areas, but the conflict with the benefits to fisheries was really high. And using this type of tool, they were able to meet almost the same conservation value, so protect as many species as they intended, but the cost incurred on the fishermen was almost halved. So these type of tools can make a big difference.
Great. Well, thank you very much to our 3 speakers. Thank you also, ladies and gentlemen, to all of you who were following this webinar and for your questions. If you did submit a question and didn't get an answer straight away, please do look at the Oppla website where we will be writing things up. Also, just to say, this time next week will be our 5th webinar series, so please register for that if you're interested. But otherwise, I wish you all a very good week and hope to see you again on Monday. Thank you very much and goodbye.